bag is here, if you wanted the bag. I spoke to Deepak. He has requested the following order. You will speak first, sir. You and then you'll be the third, sir. No problem. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to the discussion on Professor Deepak Lal's book, War or Peace, Struggle for World Power, organized by Praman and Oxford University Press, Delhi. We are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Manmohan Singh, former Prime Minister of India, with us this evening. Thank you. We feel very honored, sir, and are very grateful that you have spared your valuable time to be with us this evening. Professor Deepak Lal is a distinguished scholar of Praman, Policy Research and Management Network, our recently formed research institute, which undertakes research on aspects of public policy and international affairs. The mission of Praman is to help improve the quality of public policy formulation, implementation, and evaluation through creation and dissemination of knowledge. The institute also undertakes customized policy training. Praman has distinguished scholars as members such as Professor Deepak Lal, Professor Barbara Lal, Dr. Biswajit Banerjee, Dr. Indira Rajaraman, Dr. Amitendu Palit, and Dr. Parama Singh Palit, among others. The launch of Professor Lal's book is our inaugural event, and we are very happy that we have a distinguished gathering of persons who have joined us on this occasion. Professor Deepak Lal is the James S. Coleman Professor Emeritus of International Development Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles, USA, and Professor Emeritus of Political Economy at University College London, UK. He was a member of the Indian Foreign Service. He has been a consultant to the Indian Planning Commission, research administrator at the World Bank, and a consultant to various international agencies and governments. Some of his earlier books include Unfinished Business, India in the World Economy in 1999, In Praise of Empires, 2005, and The Hindu Equilibrium, India 1500 BC to 2000. We have a distinguished and eminent panel to comment on the book by Professor Deepak Lal. We have Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, Dr. Surjit Bhalla, and Commodore Uday Bhaskar. It is now my privilege to introduce them to this gathering. Dr. Surjit Bhalla is a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He has been chairman of Oxus Investments, a Delhi-based research and portfolio management firm. An eminent economist, he has a PhD in economics from Princeton. He has worked at the Rand Corporation, Brookings Institute, the World Bank, Goldman Sachs, Deutsche Bank, and has taught also at the Delhi School of Economics. Dr. Bhalla has served on several committees of the Government of India and has been a member of the National Statistical Commission of India. He is author of several academic articles as well as 4 books on globalization. Imagine There Is No Country, Poverty, Inequality, and Growth in the Era of Globalization, 2002. Underappreciated Growth, How Competitive Exchange Rates Matter, 2009. The Middle Class Kingdoms of China and India, and Second Among Equals, both in 2007. Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon was National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, 2010 to 2014. Foreign Secretary of India, October 2006 to 2009, and has served as the Indian Ambassador or High Commissioner to China, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Israel. In 2016, he published Choices, Inside the Making of Foreign Policy. He is currently a visiting professor at Ashoka University, India, Chairman Advisory Board of Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi, Distinguished Visiting Research Fellow at the National University of Singapore, Member Board of Trustees, International Crisis Group, and a Distinguished Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute, New York. He has been a Fisher Family Fellow at the Kennedy School, Harvard University, 2015, and Robert Wilhelm Fellow at MIT in 2015. He was chosen one of the top 10 global thinkers by Foreign Policy magazine in 2010. Commodore Uday Bhaskar, who served in the Indian Navy, is one of India's leading experts and critics on security and strategic affairs, and is currently the director of the Society for Policy Studies an independent think tank based in New Delhi. Earlier, he headed the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis and the National Maritime Foundation. He worked as an editor of Maritime Affairs and Strategic Analysis and is currently serving on the editorial board of Contemporary Security Policy. He has edited several books on nuclear, maritime, and international security-related issues and has contributed research articles to reputed journals both in India and abroad. He is a life member of the United Services Institute. I'll just say a few words about the book because we already have such a distinguished panel. Professor Lal's book argues that as in 2014 today, there are many flashpoints with revanchist and rising powers challenging the current, what he calls the current global hegemon, which he says could lead to a third world war. Against this backdrop, the book actually examines the situation in world politics following the 2008 global financial crisis when America was viewed by China and some other countries as a declining economic power. China's fast growth in the past 3 decades and its successful weathering of these crises led many leaders in China and Russia to believe that it had discovered an alternative and more successful economic model, the so-called Beijing Consensus, to replace the classical liberal model or the Washington model being promoted by the West. Many scholars have also held that the flaws of free market-based capitalism were responsible for the crisis. Professor Lal challenges these assumptions and argues that the liberal international economic order established by the US and from which China has also benefited remains strong, and the illiberal systems promoted by China and Russia are not going to be the future. With a new regime and the US's continuing overwhelming economic and military strength, he feels it can maintain its global hegemony by challenging this league of dictators who are threatening the superpower status of the United States and the liberal international order it has underwritten. What is perhaps interesting for many of us is that in this ongoing battle for ascendancy, the tussle between the 2 largest emerging economies, China and India, is of great importance. He sees it as one between the Chinese hare and the Indian tortoise, in which many see an inevitable victory for China, but he is not so sure. And this is a central question that animates the book. The book is an interdisciplinary and multi-layered one, covering both geopolitics and geoeconomics of the international order and the power struggle between the developed and the developing worlds. We will now begin the proceedings. I invite Professor Deepak Lal to say a few words about his book.
Excuse me, I'm lame, so I can't get up on the podium, so I'll speak from here. You know, I think the best thing for me to state is why I wrote this book. I first went to China in, I think, 1974. And at that time, people were in mouse suits. There was hardly any traffic in Tiananmen Square, anywhere like that. And then I've been going there virtually every year till fairly recently, mainly to Peking University in Fudan. And I also got to know some of the decision makers. I forgot his name now, the one who actually, Peking University, of course, for some of my students were the center of all this stuff in Tiananmen Square. And some were killed, and I think some are still in exile. But the thing was, it was extraordinary, this transformation from bicycles and Mars suits. And now, the strongest symbol I have in my mind, which I first saw, I think, must have been about 1980, maybe a bit earlier. Anyway, this was a small house, which some of you have probably seen, in Shanghai, where the Communist Party was born. Okay, it's a very nice small house. Now, if you go there, this is gone. Well, it's not gone, it's there, but it's completely surrounded by one of the most modern malls you can see, where every single outlet of modern capitalism has its home. And there you see all these Chinese youth, everyone is. And there you always wonder, what are these people who started this Communist Party here looking down, thinking about this, or this change which has taken place? Now, all this fooled us, at least fooled me, in thinking there's great growth, all this is going to end up with China becoming a normal country, becoming I suppose, in some sense, not quite like the West, but close enough, and would gradually move towards democracy. Okay, now let's fast forward. In 2011, this is after, just after the GFC, I was at a forum in Fudan University. And this is the first time I heard, and this had both military people, academics, and various other things. And there I heard for the first time that the aim of China now was to replace the US as a hegemon, create its own, what you might call, well, I mean, an imperial system based on what had been the standard view of China as the Middle Kingdom. That means the emperor at the center, vassals all around. And this then seemed to be a repudiation of what had been the strategy up till then. And if you look at other rising powers, and it's not surprising they all want to, become hegemons, gain greater power. After the end of the First World War, there were two: Germany and Japan were the two major ones. Of course, the others. Now, both took the military route to achieve great power. Both were, shown to be completely useless. And then after the war, both of them became trading states. They decided it was much better to gain power, economic power, and all that goes with it, through being trading states. And my view, till the seminar in 2011 in Fudan, was that is the path China was on. But from then on, it's been clear to me that this is no longer the case. China has gone back to old ways. And under President Xi, it's quite clear now that he wants to be the emperor of China. He's done all these things. And effectively now, they're going back to the bad old ways. Now, one of these bad old ways, what they call dealing with barbarians, was, and that's evident now in the so-called BRICS, there was a tribe, nomadic tribe, of this called, they're from the steppes, and they were called the Xiongnu, and they're formidable mounted nomad warriors, and they attacked the Western Han continuously from 206 BCE. They were self-sufficient. And the first thing the Chinese did was to make them dependent on Han-produced goods. Okay? These were first supplied free, and then over time, when the Han became stronger, they turned these exchange for services into tribute and convert them into de facto vassals. Now, for me, this current brick and road, whatever it's called, Belt and Road, etc., this has tremendous echoes. This is exactly what they're trying to do with the Maldives. They've done it to some extent with Sri Lanka. But the most interesting one now is Pakistan. If this history is there, and I'm delighted with what commentators are saying, it seems to me that if the Chinese, their main thing in this is really trying to prevent, I think, terrorists getting to Xinjiang. And the bit of the road they're most interested in is the one which goes through Azad Kashmir, because that's the one they have a hope to be able to attach as they've detached Hanambota in Sri Lanka. So this is coming on from what some of the lessons from this. So essentially, China, by the time I started writing this book, it was quite clear to me that there's great disorder now in the world. In fact, the Pope has repeatedly said that, we now, after the great hope placed in the end of the Cold War, where the US is the only superpower, by now there's great disorder. The Pope has described it as a mini Third World, a piecemeal Third World War. So part of the book tries to trace the origins of this. I think that one of the major sources of this, which has led to these league of dictators taking advantage, if you like, of the vacuum which has been created, was the GFC, the Great Recession, and that this, in some sense, led these various countries, particularly China and Russia, to think that the US was in decline, its economic model had to be replaced, and they had an opening, and they made good use of it. Now, that in itself would not have been sufficient until you had reactions by what can you call the major US presidents. And I think both the younger Bush and Obama made a lot of errors of commission and omission, which in fact have led now to the US, I mean, until recently, after Obama did not enforce his red lines in Syria, and there are various other things, it is quite clear that now, as far as the Middle East, and maybe many other parts of the world, the US has retired as the sole superpower, something like that. Now, this is not because others can challenge it, really, but just to beat the world. And it'll be interesting to see if President Trump can restore this. Anyway, in the middle of all this, my cover describes where India is. I think there's a picture of it there. So the book is about the Chinese dragon, the American eagle sitting still on top, and the poor Indian dove with his star, with his little, olive branch there, caught in this web there. So part of the book also deals with how India came to be in this sort of position, and it goes back to Curzon, Nehru, various mistakes which were made. The crucial one was allowing Tibet to be taken over by the Chinese. So, and here Curzon is brilliant, because Curzon was the person who created this ring of protectorates built on the Roman Empire to keep the Raj thing. Now that's gradually been whittled away. On the west, it went when Pakistan was created, and in the north, with Tibet, that meant this huge plateau high up is now a very dangerous geographical feature for India. So effectively, this book is really, I can't summarize it except by, I think, the conclusions. The conclusions are, is there a danger of a Third World War? Now, the best answer to this is provided in a book which E.H. Carr wrote about the origins of it's a flawed book for many reasons, but he gave 3 reasons for because we've got all these crises now, they're all multiplying. When can these crises lead to war? And he said that there are 3 critical factors which can turn potential crisis into lead to war. One is the presence of powerful and resentful states situated outside the international order. Now, we've got a number of these. Russia, China really look upon themselves like this, Iran, or Turkey to some extent. So there are lots of potential troublemakers, if you like. Okay? The second is profound and sustained disruption of the global economy. Now, this happened with the GFC, but I argue that effectively now, people who think that the US is finished economically and all this, they're just barking up the wrong tree. I don't think that's true. And as we've seen, there was all this talk about secular stagnation, but during the last year, the US economy has again progressed to growth rates, to sometimes even higher. Whether this is a sugar rush based on tax cuts, we'll have to wait and see. The third one was crucial: the unwillingness and inability of any single power or hegemon to underwrite the international order. Now we have this. Now, how did this happen? Because if you remember, at the end of the Cold War, there's all this talk about, this is now the end of history, where the whole world will go democratic. Fukuyama wrote a book about it. And within a short period, this has just been overturned. Now, I think one can argue about the origins of the Iraq War, the Afghanistan and all this, and, there's right and wrong on both sides. But the trouble is that what happened in Iraq, particularly, after the terrorist thing was put down by Petraeus, was that the US, at that stage, had a pretty strong position in Iraq. Okay, and then and Bush, as far as I remember, had actually, after he got an agreement for part of the US Army to stay there, and he wanted to enforce this. Now, Obama withdrew this without even getting this, and that, of course, was the start of the ISIL movement and the takeover in Syria. And then, of course, it became much worse when he drew his weapon. So that was the, I call it the retirement by Obama of the US as a superpower, and we're still living with the consequences.
I now invite Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon to make his comments.
Respected Manmohan Singh ji, friends, Deepak Lal has written a text that he's just introduced to you, which is really quite a remarkable book because it tries to make sense of this flux that is all around us in this magisterial survey, both of geoeconomics, of geopolitics, and actually tries to then predict the big questions of the day, of nothing less than the future of war and peace in our century. And he's confident enough not to put a question mark after war or peace, which shows something. I mean, it really, which is what makes the book worth reading, because he's quite happy to tell you his conclusions and to put them out there for you to think about, argue, and so on with. And it's a large book. I mean, it's large in every sense of the word, 496 pages, but it's a book of big ideas and big themes. And what I'd like to do is maybe to speak to a few of those themes, the nature of the international system, Pax Americana, China's trajectory, and our situation and where we end up after from where we are. Now, when you look at the international system, Professor Lal is an old school liberal. He's a realist with an ideology. It's a good combination, actually, because it allows for some thinking about ideology, about culture. It's not just pure balance of, it's not a mechanical system where all states behave the same. If he had a heart, he would be Kantian, but he's not. But when he traces where we are today, he believes that we're moving away from the liberal international economic order, which basically the US ran since World War II. The problem is the US ran two separate orders. If you look at the order immediately after the Second World War, it was the order of a hegemon who wants to have a say in your foreign policy, but is not really bothered about your domestic policy. India could run socialist policies at home and still be the biggest borrower from the World Bank, which basically the US controlled. But after 1989, the nature of the US imperium, or Pax Americana, as he calls it, changed. And the Washington Consensus also wanted to tell you how to run your domestic policy. This became an empire by Thucydides' definition, by the definition that Professor Lal uses as well. That's a very different thing from wanting to determine what other states do. And that lasted from 89 till about 2008, global financial crisis, became world economic crisis. Since then, we've been in flux. And we're in a situation where, frankly, if you say, what's the global order? What's the international order? None of us have a word for this. We all say we're between orders, we're in a transition to what we don't know, from what even we disagree on. So we're in this very peculiar situation, and it takes a brave man to actually break that down into pieces and tell you where it's going, which is what he does in the book. But I do agree with the way he breaks it down. When he says that there is a myth of US decline, and he proves actually in several chapters about overwhelming US preponderance in population, in economic strength, in military terms. I mean, you look at the US Navy, the British never had more than a standard. Their standard was they should be stronger than the next two navies put together. For the US, it's how many? 13? Next 13 navies put together don't add up to what the US has today. I mean, that is real dominance. This is a whole different kind of world that we're talking about. And that is really overwhelming dominance. The problem is we don't know whether the US still has the will to use that power. And we don't also know whether that power is as useful as it used to be. The normal assumption is that maritime power, since the age of Vasco da Gama, since 1498, since he came to Calicut, maritime power has basically dominated the land and has determined the course of world history and has run the international order. But is that still true? If you look at what technology has done, military technology, the precision of remote sensing, the precision of conventional weapons now, and the lethality of those weapons. Today, China does area denial, access denial, and area denial and anti-access in the seas near her, and has really converted the South China Sea into a Chinese lake by using shore-based weapons, basically, missiles, fighter aircraft, artillery, and building islands, building more land, basically, and using the land against the sea to control the sea, rather than the traditional manner which we've got used to over several centuries. So I'm not sure. The nature of power is shifting. So the US might have huge preponderance, but in our neighborhood, we have two problems. One is when the US follows an Indo-Pacific strategy, she has implicitly conceded the continental order to the continental powers, who today are Russia and China. I mean, that's what it amounts to. Secondly, is she willing to use the power that she has, which is maritime? That's a question we really don't know. And that's a hard one to answer for us. The other element on which, again, I find myself in agreement, but I think we need a little more granularity, is China's future trajectory, where Professor Lal goes into considerable detail, but seems to tend towards the view, and here I hope he sums up at the end, that China is really on a downward trajectory. Now, this may be true in the long term. Her demography is not very favorable. By 2040, China's demography will be about the same as Japan's today. If the economy reverts to mean, as seems to be happening, then growth will slow like it did in all the other Asian tigers, etc. But it's not collapsing. And it's still going to be a huge power, both economic and military, right on our frontiers that we'll have to deal with. So that whatever you might say about the world order, we are going to have to deal with an Asia and a periphery where this is a real issue. And I'm not sure that we have the answers to that. Now, when it comes to India and how do we deal with the situation, that's where I think, again, I find myself in agreement with the basic thrust of his arguments, but I think we both come to the same conclusions from very different starting points. Because he argues, like Panikkar and like Curzon and like the British strategists, of India's insular nature and history, its endemic instability, the fact that it was only united for 8 centuries out of 22, etc., which I think, frankly, is a self-serving version of Indian history that we have been fed by the British to justify empire. If you look at our history in practice, I mean, how is it that India was one of the most advanced, was the most industrialized for most of history, when it is supposedly so insular, so broken, so fragmented, because that history is the history of a very small portion of India, of the Indo-Gangetic Valley, perhaps. It ignores the bits. You look at the Great Divergence until 1850, actually. If you look at areas like Gujarat, the Coromandel Coast, Bengal, they were as developed as the Yangtze Delta, Zhejiang, Hangzhou, and Northern Europe. I mean, whether it's the Netherlands today. And so, frankly, it's hard to reconcile this version of history, and especially that religious periodization that was imposed on us, with what you actually know of the facts and of our connections with Southeast Asia, with the West Asia, and so on. But we end up at the same point, frankly. We might start from different starting points, but we do, I think, he describes India as an imperial power, I'm not sure what imperial, trapped in the middle between all the major flashpoints. And the two biggest ones, of course, are the rise of Islamic fundamentalism in the Middle East and the flashpoints created by China's rise, which includes the South China Sea and so on, and our own boundary dispute with them. He thinks that India has a Tibet card, that India should build alliances against Chinese aggressiveness, create an implicit cordon sanitaire, which, by the way, didn't work very well against the Soviet Union in the last time it was tried. But he also says that we can catch up and surpass the Chinese hair by 2027. Now, don't ask me to tell you the details. Please buy the book and read it if you want to know. And I think he's right in describing the kinds of things that are available. I'm not so sure when he says Tibet card. For instance, I'm not sure that we had realistic options in 1950 when China moved in. For a very simple reason. India was not the successor to the Raj in geopolitical terms and could not be. In the first place, we lost control of our maritime neighborhood because the Royal Navy was no longer taking care of that, and we had to actually start from scratch. Secondly, partition cut us off from Central Asia and divided the subcontinent and gave us a war on our hands from day one. And thirdly, when the Chinese moved into Tibet, and Tibet, it was not the Himalayas, it was the buffer of Tibet, which actually had protected India. Once the Chinese moved in, we had a boundary with the Chinese for the first time ever. We had a boundary with Tibet before that, but we never had a boundary with China. And we never had an armed presence on our borders like that before. So we had a completely different geopolitical situation. There was no way we could have reacted the way, say, Curzon would have or anybody else. And I think we need to make that distinction in our mind and look at what was practical policy. Today, we have a very different situation, and it's not an easy situation at all. If you look at it, you have a belt, a continuous belt of weapons of mass destruction all the way from the Mediterranean, from Israel, to the Pacific, to North Korea, of either nuclear, chemical, possibly biological, which nobody knows anything about, all the way across. You see the Eurasian continent being consolidated under, primarily, Belt and Road tries to do it under Chinese auspices. The Russians have not much choice but to work with them. You see today a real risk of the fragmentation of the globalized economy, thanks to Sino-US contention and what we see now happening, which seems to be structural. It's not just, here's a new administration trying something new. And most important, we don't seem to be very organized mentally about how we're going to respond to this. For 3 years, we've been raising customs duties. We're almost as though we're cutting ourselves off from the world, rather than when, frankly, if we don't get into, more than half our GDP today depends on merchandise, trade, and services with the rest of the world. So it's not as though we like to think of ourselves as insular, as domestically driven economy, but we're not anymore. And we can't certainly cut ourselves off from the world. So that's a very good reason to read the book, because it's a very good description, a good realist description of what is going on around us. There is one bit, though, that I do have, the problem with this level of historical generalization and sweep is that we sometimes miss the granularity of reality. For instance, I mean, there's repeated mentions of Rome, which, frankly, if you look at world history, Rome was a sideshow, both as a contributor to world GDP or in terms of the welfare of numbers of people. I mean, it was Persia, India, and China which mattered, and for most of history. To speak of Pax Britannica, for instance, is to ignore the fact that, Britain was pacified after centuries of spectacular bloodletting, but by exporting war. and violence to the rest of the world, first to the New World, and then to Asia, and then to Africa. I mean, this was European war waged with European technologies of destruction around the world. So this was not as though it was suddenly things were really peaceful. Britain was peaceful. Europe was peaceful for 70 years and ignored the little wars they fought among themselves, German reunification, Italian reunification. But the fact is that we have an idealized version of the LIE, of the liberal international economic order, of Pax Americana, of Pax Britannica, which I think once you get down into the granular details of history, doesn't really hold up. And that's where I think we need to be a little more careful when we deal with these contexts. But basically, this is a book that I would recommend without reservations to anybody who is interested in the world around us today and how it's going to affect us. This is a book to enjoy, to wallow in, to argue with as you read it, and to put down with regret after 496 pages that there isn't more. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, for your very interesting comments. I now invite Dr. Surjit Bhalla to please make his comments.
Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, Deepak Lal, and guests at this very, very important book and lecture. Let me just read, and there will be a fair amount of, not fair amount, but certainly in summary, great parallels with what Shiv Shankar Menon just said. So I'll just read you the first paragraph, and after that this is yet again a brilliant book from Deepak Lal. There's an added gem in this book. It is made eminently readable for non-economists, non-political scientists, and non-philosophers. The coverage of the book is vast, historically, geographically, and intellectually. There's much to agree on, and for me, some views and or interpretation of history disagree on. That is as it should be. The fact remains that this is a vast canvas and should be required reading for students of history, politics, and development. And really very readable, brilliant book. So now, I'll go through some comments. First, the really positive ones, and then I'll move to where, not necessarily negative, but where I disagree with some of the stuff. And you will see from, and I'm an economist, not a political scientist, and so the coverage is vast in economics and in politics, and that will be taken over a little bit by Uday as well. First, the topic. With any book writer, etc., or anything you want to communicate, what's the big idea? What's the big theme of the book? And it is very, very relevant for our times, and it's perfect timing, and that is the future of hegemon. Who will be the next hegemon in the world? And it traces throughout history about the hegemons going way back and arrives at the present and discusses and outlines why America seems to have lost its way. Maybe it'll regain some, up for debate. And also that if it is not the US, who it is. And this is where, for the Indian audience, there's some stuff to hang on to. That look, the US may not be, Russia and Japan, etc., are tangential. The real big dragon in the room is China. And maybe, because China is not necessarily, there's a lot to fear of China, it may not necessarily be a good hegemon. And that's where India comes in, that in cooperation, obviously, and support of the other world powers, this might be our time. So, now this was written 2 years ago or so, and so there are some parts that are not there. But look at, if it was written 2 years ago, And what are we in the midst of right now? Trump and his trade war with China. So that is, you couldn't have planned it better in terms of what, if you will, anticipating what Trump might do. And, this war with China is something, as you will see, I will disagree with some, but there is a lot of at least empathy, sympathy, agreement from my side that China is, I'll just confess, is getting what it deserves. It was a long, long, long time coming. And I've written a book on the subject and so on and so forth as to how China really exploited the world. And the interesting political economy of the world is the world allowed it very willingly to do it, especially the Americans. When I wrote my book, Devaluing to Prosperity, it met with a lot of opposition from American economists and the rest. So this is something, more power to you, Deepak. I'm all the way with you on this one. And I think for Indians, most of us, or a lot of us, let me not generalize, may not like Trump, do not like Trump and what he's doing. But I think on the war with China, as an Indian, it is something I think we all agree on. And I don't think it is because we are Indians, but be that as it may. Now I'll come to some of the points, and this just shows the canvas on, there's a long discussion on freedom, democracy, and political and economic freedom. So one of the tidbits, which obviously I elaborated on length, is that he does a very good job of busting the myth that it is the wretched of the earth who resort to revolutions. It is the middle class that does it and does it throughout history. But it's nice to get, on political and economic freedom, and this is the role of democracy, that there's been a lot of literature that democracy, both sides of the literature, dictatorship helps growth because you can make decisions faster. You don't have a polity that is diverse and disagreeable to pass any judgment. And the classic example there is, of course, China. And contrast that with India, which is bumbling along and doesn't seem to get its act together, though I'll soon show how we have incredibly got our act together. But that was before 2014 that we got our act together, in case any of you are thinking that it is only at the present. But, on political and economic freedom, what has not been explained, and, in all the discussions, and I think this is very important, and Deepak does this theme full justice, except it should have gone a little step further. Why did East Asian economies do so well? This is one of the big economic facts. And most of them were dictatorships, etc., like China, the East Asian. They weren't really democracies like India. They have now become democracy, Korea, etc., but Korea was a military dictatorship. And they did well, and this is a lesson we only started to learn in 1991, because they had economic freedom. So it is not, 2 points I want to make. It is not that the democracy and political freedom doesn't help growth. I think it does help growth. But the major contributor between the two is economic freedom. And as I said, we wasted something like 50 years before we latched on to that very small idea, which has now obviously become quite big. So I think, a little more discussion on Confucianism. That wasn't really the role of economic freedom, and this is where Deepak invokes, and correctly, Hayek, who I think is along with Deepak, also somebody I have admired a lot. Then on, one element that Deepak should have spent more time on, and this is not in disagreement, but this is in terms of the discussion on India in particular and China, is why did India succeed in being democratic? If one goes through the literature, the historical analysis, etc., nobody gave India a chance that we would succeed as a democracy. And I think some discussion of that, my own contribution to that, or my own interpretation, is that we became a democracy first because we were colonized by the British. That itself gets you something like 65% probability that you would be a democracy. The second, and this Deepak does have in the discussion, is that we are a very, very diverse, ethnically, culturally, and in opinions, economy and a polity. And the only way such disparate people can agree on anything is through a democratic process. So I think that's where we come. Now I'll come to some points of disagreement with Deepak, but in full agreement on the topics covered. So it is very rich, no matter what view you have. There will be something that you will agree with, something that you will disagree with, but you won't be able to ignore any of the vast amounts of evidence that Deepak presents. I would say, while I'm being all praise for Deepak on the vast amount of evidence, etc., and the set of topics, there are two topics on which I think he's got it all wrong. One is on climate change. And Deepak, we don't have to wait, none of us are going to be waiting 200 years to find out if the solar theory and the sunspots theory is right or whatever. I think, climate change is real, is bad, and it's here. And the second one is on, and it shows the intellectual interest and depth of Deepak that he goes into, which fits in a broad way very much with this theme about the new emerging powers in China in particular, is sex ratio. Now my wife is over here who's done a lot of work on this, and I've worked a little bit with her. But there is this book, which is absolutely one of the more nonsensical books around, by Debreuer and Hudson, who believe that because of the population explosion in China, they'll have nothing else to do with their men but send them to battle. Now, this was before the women's liberation came into the world in a really, really big way. This book was written somewhere in 2010 or whatever. But really, that's the weakest part of the book, so I won't say anything more on it. Now, on two or three, I've got 5 minutes. 2 or 3 economic issues where I wish Deepak had gone a bit further and discussed its implications for the world and for India. One of them is the death of inflation. Now, Deepak brings in about deficits and deficit financing and debt and all the rest of it, which were all topics that we all grappled with, the world grappled with for a long, long time. But I think the big theme in the world right now, economically speaking, is the death of inflation. Now, don't tell that to the RBI, because they also believe that inflation is your number one problem. With 3.5% inflation, how they get that is perhaps a discussion for some other time. But while we are dwelling on, institutions and their role in development, etc., we should note that as far as the RBI is concerned, and as far as inflation is concerned, they don't even follow their own models of inflation, let alone any other model of inflation. So, but this book, as I said, was written some time back, and this is covered. And he comes out on the side of monetarism. Nothing wrong with that, except I think monetarism is also dead and has been back. Now, before anybody in the discussion or anything comes out, oh my God, if I increase inflation, money supply by 1,000%, what do you think is going to happen to prices? Of course, you'll have 1,000% inflation. But in a wide range of money supply growth in the Western world, in the developing world, across the world, that inflation is dead, and I think that's the big theme to be looked into. Now, 2 topics, and this in particular that is not dealt with at length, but is dealt, and that I want to bring up in order, one thing about India and China is that in this contrast, compare and contrast, which you all do, and Deepak has a lot of sections on that, India gets a very bad press. And most of the bad press is generated by the Indians themselves. Mostly NRIs, but I think a dominant in India. Why that is the case? Now let me illustrate how we get a bad press and we take it lying down. Okay? As a matter of fact, not to mention encourage it. Take poverty. Okay? And this is where, no matter where you go, right? Look what China has done to poverty removal and look what India has done. Fair? I'm not setting up a straw man or a straw woman. That is the reality. And that constantly comes up. Well, let's look at India's record of poverty removal, and I will end it in 2011-12. So again, don't confuse it with the polarization and the political debate, etc. now. Nothing to do with anything beyond 2011-12. So in 2011-12, poverty rate, according to the World Bank poverty line, exactly the same as for India, exactly the same for China, and as it happens, it is the Indian Tendulkar poverty line. In 2011-12, absolute poverty in India was 12%. In 2009-10, absolute poverty in China was 9%. Now please tell me, are the two things not completely comparable? Why is it that we haven't done enough to reduce absolute poverty? And China has done so much. Oh, it's a model. Second, and this aspect, so Deepak does discuss this poverty thing, but not the contrast with China. And the second aspect on which we Indians willingly allow us to be beaten is on inequality. And of course, we have Piketty's analysis, which Deepak correctly tries to put holes in, but I wish there were more Deepaks in the world. And Piketty's analysis shows that Indian inequality in India has zoomed through the skies. It's the most unequal country in the world. And again, the political atmosphere in India is such that the study ends in 2014. But I'm the only one attacking Piketty besides Deepak for the nonsense that is there in his stuff. And the Indian economists, dare not say anything about Piketty because they think that, if they say anything against Piketty, then they're saying something in favor of the present administration. Because they think that the parallel Indian inequality has gone up, obviously now, and therefore they can't come out and attack Piketty. But there's real tragedy about our scholars, about our media, about our economists, that this thing hasn't been taken head on. One little last tidbit on Piketty. Piketty has done this analysis first with somebody called Abhijit Banerjee, an Indian economist from MIT. And they did this study on Indian inequality, and they ended their study in 1998, from 1922 to 1998, and the new Piketty study is from 1922 to 2014. And they cannot even, the new Piketty cannot even reproduce the Banerjee-Piketty results for India in 1998, and shows that his new study, India in 1998, was much more unequal than it was in 1998 according to Banerjee and Piketty. So I think we really, and I will conclude over here, that I think the one message in this entire battle between India and China as to who is forward, who's backward, who's done things right, who's not done things right, I think we get a raw deal. And I would only plead with all economists, political scientists, all students, that give India a fair hearing before you jump to conclusions about China. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bhalla. I now invite Commodore Bhaskar for his comments.
Dr. Manmohan Singh, a former Prime Minister, very eminent members on the panel, and friends. I'm the sailor in this lot, so I'm the last guy to share my thoughts with you. I want to thank our hosts, Praman and OUP, for giving me this opportunity to be able to discuss, some parts of this book with you. I'm in this happy situation that, many of the large areas of, shall we say, acknowledgement and agreement have already been identified by Ambassador Menon and Dr. Surjit Bhalla. So I'll only commend and recognize Dr. Lal's book, Professor Deepak Lal's book, as a very important contribution. And Mrs. Lal, ma'am, you're in the audience. So I would request you to convey to Ruby, Albert, and Alexander, the grandchildren, who have been acknowledged in the beginning of the book, that for this evening, their granddad was like a rock star. Everyone's saying that Deepak Lal has, done an outstanding book. Let me commend him for that. Those of you who know Professor Lal and his considerable contribution to academia over the years, Columbia and elsewhere, I met him this evening for the first time. I've only followed his work most recently in the columns of the Business Standard. TN Nayanan is here, so I want to acknowledge the Business Standard and the range of contributors he has. And I was intrigued by this economist who was taking a lunge at, big ticket items, strategic issues, He was discussing the interface between strategy, geoeconomics, politics, and, as I said, it was interesting. Some of his formulations were intriguing. So these days we have Hazrat Google. When in doubt, you can Google. So I Googled Dr. Lal, Professor Lal, and found that, he had a range of books going back to the late 70s, early 80s. And most recently, he had something on empire. And those of you who know him and who follow his kind of work, he has become the equivalent of what you might call as the academic patron saint of empire. 2004 was when he wrote this book. I also want to add in parenthesis that I did not quite agree with what he said in 2004, and maybe we can at some point discuss. It was in praise of empires, globalization and order. This was the 2004 book. And now, as Shankar Menon has pointed out, this is war and peace. And there is no doubt in Deepak Lal's mind about where we are headed. It's an uneasy world. It's a bleak kind of view about, and somewhere in the preface, he draws attention to the misery that has been brought to bear on large sections of the world where these proxy wars are continuing. But I'll come to the war part a little later. I thought that, I spent a lot of my time reviewing books, and I started with the eminent Mr. Shyam Lal in Bombay. He was this, very great editor in the Times of India. And there was a certain protocol about how books were reviewed. And, as I said, there were some bits I learned about reviewing books. And one of them is due diligence. And I just want to share this part for the younger members in the audience here, the students, academics, and others, that this is a book. Shankar has already used the word magisterial. Surjit has said vast. So I'm going to fall back on a Trumpism. This book is huge, almost 500 pages. And more than that, for those of you who read books more, as I said, diligently, it has 840 endnotes over the 12 chapters that it has. And this is a delight for an academic or a professional. And in the preface, he says that he wanted to make this book for the layperson, not for the economist, not for the philosopher, not for the professional. So he said, I've banished the endnotes. But I just want to say for those of you who propose to get the book and read it, do dive into the endnotes. They are a treasure trove in terms of the scope of the research that he's done, the reading that he's done. He's a man who spans many disciplines. And there is a vast bibliography. There were many books there, references that I did not quite know of, and I want to thank him because I see myself as a student to some of these areas, and he, as I said, brought to light, various references that would be very useful for students and those who want to pursue this. I will not touch, this book is broadly into 3 or 2 parts, I would say. One is on geopolitics, one is on geoeconomics. And geoeconomics is above my pay grade, so Surjeet has already spoken about it, so I will not address that part. I'll just, it's an academic, it's a professor's book. If you read it, the segue, the transition from geopolitics to geoeconomics is very interesting. He talks about, the principles, the postulates, and, does a very detailed survey. And again, for me, as a student of security and strategic issues, what was very interesting is that the section on geography is almost 90 pages. Sir, that's a tremendous kind of contribution, because I have long felt, as a student of this issue and India's own experience, its security trajectory, that perhaps the Indian policymakers were somewhere oblivious to geography, particularly strategic geography. And what Professor Lal does is to shine the torch and bring this into focus. And let me add to some of the broad points made by Ambassador Menon and Dr. Bhalla, which is that the focus of this book is China. And in the preface, Professor Lal gives us a reason as to why he decided, first of all, to look at China, and why he expanded the scope of the book. His own unease about the rise of China is palpable. He had drawn attention to this in earlier writings also, but he does try and pull this all together. And he talks about the liberal international economic order, the LIEO. And he has certain prescriptions, and here is the caveat. I did not quite agree with everything that he had to say about China, for instance, and the way China is to be dealt with. There is some detail here, and I wanted to again make this particular proposition, that if you look at the Deepak Lal formulation, and I'm taking the liberty of reading, the first section, what is the objective of this book? War or Peace, and Professor Deepak Lal's own research on this. He says in his preface, and I quote, "At the end of the book, In Praise of Empires," this is Deepak Lal, I had written, quote, "Perhaps if the United States is unwilling to shoulder the imperial burden of maintaining the global pax, we will have to wait for one or the other of the emerging imperial states." I think Shankar already question marked the imperial part, China and India, to do so in the future. So this is the line that he has taken from the previous book. And in this book, he argues that both geopolitics and geoeconomics that he has leavened together, I quote again, that there is a case for hope that it will be India rather than China that will prevail. And then he goes on to say, and this is the interesting part, and I'll stop the quote here, he talks about the US. And he says, if as in the last century, the declining imperial power, the UK, joined the US in passing on the baton of a liberal international economic order to see off various authoritarian challengers, will the US, and this is the question, with other liberal democracies, join India in seeing that when and if US power declines, the imperial baton goes to India and not China? Unquote. That is the central question which animates the book, and this is where I would offer a slightly different kind of, shall we say, formulation, where I maintain that Professor Lal is very bullish about India. And Surjeet has already drawn attention to some of the tangible indicators. And I felt that one area which perhaps could have been more explored to make the case more persuasive was culture. This is a book that, apart from geoeconomics and geopolitics, also makes a little diversion into culture. It has certain specific kind of references. For instance, a very interesting exploration of Iran. And Shiism in Iran is part of the endnotes. And again, Professor Lal makes certain, shall we say, propositions about which way Iran is likely to go based on its own domestic dynamic. I would make the case, sir, for your consideration, that when we talk about India and China, that apart from all the tangible indicators, the GDPs, the military power, and whatever else you can quantify, perhaps a deeper exploration into the strategic culture of both these countries and why they have evolved in the way that they have over the last 70 years, And one of the issues that perhaps could have been explored, it would have burnished, I think, the argument, is path dependency. And since Dr. Manmohan Singh is here, sir, I'll take the liberty of illustrating this point, that when India and the US embarked upon the rapprochement, the nuclear rapprochement, which began in 2005, and we came down to the wire, and we just about squeaked through in 2008. Again, as a student, as an analyst, I have said this in the past, I'm saying it again, that but for the fact that we had these two principles, Mr. Bush in the United States and you, sir, Dr. Manmohan Singh in Delhi, we would not have perhaps reached the point that both India and the United States did. And therefore, some degree of a review of path dependency as one of the elements when we talk about the flux and the various kinds of disorder. Here again, as an aside, I have spent some time on the semantics of IR. And I remember that when Mr. K. Subramaniam, my former boss, was there, we grew up in the Cold War. So there was clarity. We had bipolarity. We had the United States and we had the former Soviet Union. Boris Yeltsin on the tank, the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and there was a lot of debate. I remember we sat in the IIC and we spoke about what would be the appropriate semantic. Would it be a multipolar world order? Would it be a polycentric world order? Is there any pole left? Is there any centricity? These are questions, I think, that animate the book. And perhaps one of the issues or one of the kind of, shall we say, arguments that could be made in terms of where we are headed is the contradictory nature of the global order or disorder, whichever way you want to describe it. And there have been some suggestions about a contra-centric world order, where there is a contradictory tension between how major powers are dealing with each other. And I felt that that is an area that Professor Lal might like to consider when he looks at the next 15 to 20 years, because there is one trend that I would again make the case is fairly, shall we say, not irrefutable, but on course, which is that by 2030, 2035, China is likely to emerge as the world's #1 GDP. The United States will be a close second. And India will be a distant third. So you do have a macroeconomic order emerging, and that incidentally is the cover of the book, which in earlier formulations some of us have referred to as the emerging uneasy strategic triangle. And the anomalous part of what is emerging is that in that particular point, 2030 or 35, for the first time in recent global history, the world's most prosperous nation, China, will not be militarily the most powerful. And India, whatever choices it makes, path dependency again for India, would be a very significant swing state in terms of realizing the objectives, whatever be the aspirations, or assuaging the anxieties that all three of them differently have. So I thought that this particular aspect of the contradictory tenor is something that, again, may be considered. And I want to touch on two other issues, if I may. One is, since there was so much of focus on geography, which again, I want to commend Professor Lal, and I would urge all the students and youngsters to read that particular section. The way in which he has mapped geography is very, very, I think, impressive. There's a reference to Mackinder, there's a reference to Spikeman, all the traditional kind of, shall we say, punctuations. But one area which I felt again, sir, that you might want to explore is the impact of technology on geography. Again, I think Ambassador Menon had made reference to this. And to the extent that geography was all about distances, and both Mackinder and Spikeman in different ways had predicated their entire, shall we say, formulations on that, what technology has done to distance, and what technology has done in terms of introducing the continuum between maritime, cyber, and space. And when you, sir, talk about dealing with China and how do you contain China, this is not the first time that this argument or this suggestion has come up. You'll recall that Condi Rice, the former US Secretary of State and NSA and Secretary of State, in her time when she spoke in Tokyo, she spoke about the need to quote unquote tether China. You remember that. The word tether translated into Chinese is not particularly, shall we say, appropriate, and that led to a different kind of, shall we say, reaction there. But I think that proposition remains. How do you deal with the creeping assertiveness of China, the lake that Ambassador Menon spoke about? And here I am saying that apart from the traditional metrics of power, military power, ordnance, precision guided, etc., that maybe there is a case to look at the interface of technology, geography, and the maritime cyberspace continuum, and the most recent, shall we say, received wisdom amongst the military professionals that you read in the think tank circuit is that what will matter is not the ordnance, it's the information dominance and the spectrum denial. So there are two aspects here, one of dominance, the second of denial, and geography is critical. We keep talking about China and Hambantota. Hambantota is not just about the port, it's about the equator. Again, I'm sure the professionals here know this, so I don't have to elaborate. But I thought, sir, that this overlap between geography and technology is something that you might want to, again, as I said, consider. The aspect about India and the bullishness about India, I have, again, a slightly different take, which is that while what Dr. Lal or Professor Lal is postulating is highly desirable, yes, India should be there, counted. I think today India does not have the credibility to be considered as a major power to whom the baton could be passed. And I say this again with some degree of, I would say, sadness, that to the extent that I have followed the Indian security story, for a variety of reasons, we have a former Prime Minister sitting with us, so I'm making bold to say this, that we have not been able to find the necessary political resolve to make a rifle or a pistol in this country. Yes, we have made nuclear weapons, yes, we have made missiles. But despite 1857, when there was firearms in UP and Bihar, this country has not been able to find that. And this is just one aside, because in the section that he talks about India's modernization and the military part, he commends India for its WMD, nuclear weapons and missiles, and makes certain suggestions. But my reading of the ground reality, the granularity that Ambassador Menon spoke about would be, I'll take 2 more minutes, ma'am, is a slightly different story. So I would only, sir, make the point that you might want to review that part on the bullishness of India as being this major power. The last is a theoretical point, which appealed to me a lot. There's a lot of IR theory in this book, references. And there's one section where Professor Lal invokes Hedley Bull. I'm sure most of you in this audience who are IR and political science people need no introduction to Hedley Bull. He talks of the immanence of power. That's a very pregnant phrase, immanence of power. And I vaguely recall as a student being introduced to Hedley Bull, and the word immanence comes with theological connotations. And if you explore Hedley Bull, and he has this fantastic, I would say, contribution when it comes to Hobbes. And Professor Lal just touches it and leaves it. When he talks about where we should be headed, and he talks about the United States, he talks about China, he talks about India, the starting word is the liberal order. My query as a reader of the book is, what if the United States becomes illiberal? Which order are we then supporting? What if India becomes illiberal? How do you do the permutations and combinations? And my, last kind of observations is that to the extent we talk about multipolar, polycentric, great power, major power, I think, in keeping with the formulation of immanence, the normative, that which would be considered to be righteous in an objective sense, what in the Indian tradition we talk about Shakti devoid of Dharma. India knew all this, somewhere it's part of the DNA. That I think the real challenge in the emerging order or disorder for India in particular is how do we become an equitable power? And I think that raises a number of issues which would be brought under the rubric of, what IR theory has tried to grapple with for a long time, about the compulsion between the principle of power and the power of principle. But on that note, I'll stop and again join the others in commending Professor Lal for an outstanding book and must read, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore Bhaskar. I'm sure you'll agree this has been an extremely interesting discussion, and there's been a very rich and complex debate, both about the book, and I think the various panelists have also, taken, put forward their views about it and have disagreed both with Professor Lal and between themselves as well, which has made the debate extremely rich. I will not even try to summarize it, except to say that the book covers very vast ground, and I'm sure all the panelists have agreed that it covers both geoeconomics, geopolitics, and the most interesting part is, of course, what is going to happen to India and China. And what is going to be the new world order? Is it going to be liberal? Is it going to be illiberal? Who is going to be the hegemon? Various questions have been thrown up. Does culture matter? Is there something called strategic culture? Really is the challenges that, as Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon said, that it's really the naval challenges that are very important where China is concerned and so on. So a whole range of issues have been opened up. Also the question of how does one theorize about international relations? What are the terms one uses? What are the concepts one uses? So I think it's been a very, very rich discussion. And now we will open up to the floor for questions. Please put up your hands. Please identify yourself and ask your questions. Is there a hand mic? Please.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm Sanjeev Srivastava, a researcher on foreign policy issues. I focus on America. My question would be to Professor Lal and also the other respected panel members that this existence of nuclear weapons and also the new international economic order, as well as enlightened citizenship, civil society awareness around the global community will help prevent a third world war, what you were mentioning in the beginning. Whether it will, the international community and the awareness about our existence and also the existence of the real weapon, the nuclear weapons, will help contain any such situation of a third world war. That's the question. Thank you.
Maybe we could take one or two more questions. Or maybe you can answer it. In the meantime, somebody else will.
Well, it could, but the trouble is, it depends what the content of this civil society movement, etc., is going to be. And the trouble with some of these civil society movements is that actually they're on the wrong side. They actually make things worse rather than better. So I'm not sure what the outcome will be.
Can I add?
Yeah.
You just want to say something, Shankar? No. I just want to add to what Professor Lal has said, since we have a little time and this is a very important question. In the course of the book, he actually does say that because of the existence of nuclear weapons, the probability of an all-out war, a great war, is a low probability. But this does not prevent the likelihood of having the equivalent of proxy wars. And he also draws attention to the various, shall we say, conflicts that have taken place. But again, I just want to add saying that when we look at the landscape, there already is this linkage between the nuclear weapon and terrorism, which we see in our own neighborhood. And again, Professor Lal's book draws attention to the Sino-Pak, nexus by which Pakistan is using the nuclear weapon. So we talk in the literature about nuclear weapon enabled terror. Now China is aware of this, and that becomes the challenge, both for India and even the United States. How do you deal with this kind of security shall we say, dynamic, where the nuclear weapon is being used by proxy for terrorism? And the book, I think,
Yes, one hand up there.
Good evening, sir. Kindly accept my heartfelt gratitude to all the author and eminent panel. India has always been stronghold of culture and spirituality. But if you see last 10-15 years, the globalization, obviously it has its advantages. But thing is, the cultural onslaught has happened with, the children viewing all those channels of all cartoons and all these things. We are probably what is going to happen after 30 years. Nowadays generation, they are I don't say aspirational India, it's restless India, rather, they don't have time to get into the nitty-gritties of any subject. They're all catchy words, that's all. The technological influence is so fast, we actually are unable to get into what is going to happen after 30, 40 years. When these generation, now obviously the think tanks which are here, that's why it's still strong. But when the younger generation will reach at the level, what is your take, sir, on this? Are we doing good enough to protect? Because the entire world looks for us because of our spirituality and culture. But are we ready to protect it? What's your take after 40 years? Where are we
I
heading?
think you'll have to explain and you'll have to repeat the question.
I didn't get the question. What's the question?
Long observation.
Yeah, what's the question?
My question is, children, with they are viewing televisions for all sorts of cartoon networks and all these things.
Yes.
Obviously, the culture which is imbibed in us and the spirituality, they are unable to catch it. When these children will go into 30, 40 years, where are we heading to?
So you're worried about the effect of television on children?
Not only television, sir, or other
Social media,
cultural
television.
impact, westernized cultural impact, aping of the westernism.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's an open question. I'm completely against most social media. I've written against it because I think it's A, irresponsible. B, it has all sorts of bad political effects, creates mobs. You can't. The old sort of civilized politics, which we is gone, largely because of social media. So it seems to me that 30 years down the road, we don't know. Mr. Zuckerberg might be in jail, which would be a good thing as far as I'm concerned. And all the other people too, who are trying to steal elections, do various things. So anyway, but I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I'm sure my daughter will be absolutely appalled at what I'm saying. But there we go. So we have to wait and see.
I'm sure the answer to this question, Suman Berry, I'm an economist. The answer to this question from Deepak is in the book, which I haven't read, but intend to. But if I could ask either Shankar Menon or Commodore Bhaskar, I mean, if you were George Kennan writing about containment of China today, what would be the goals and what would be the mechanisms? Is the ultimate goal regime change? Is that your reading of the goal of President Trump? Or is it just to say, look, thus far and no further? What are feasible goals in a 5 to 7 year horizon that India might aspire to, for example?
You want a long telegram for the US or for India?
I mean, I guess for
Because
India,
for the
but
US
I'm talking about India and the US sharing goals.
Yeah. It seems to me that part of the problem now is that unlike when Kennan was writing, China is part of the world economy, and a big part of the world economy. It actually drives the economy and is economically linked to the rest of us. So traditional containment, I mean, the way Kennan, or the way the US practiced it, not even the way Kennan wrote it, but the way the US practiced it against the Soviet Union is not an option either for the US or for anyone else. What you're seeing today is a huge debate within the US. There are people like Lighthizer, Navarro, and so on who want decoupling, economic decoupling, because it would make political, military, other containment possible. But that's not necessarily the expressed view. If you read the Pence speech, which I presume is the official line, the 4th of October speech, that's not what it's aiming at. What it's aiming at is changing Chinese behavior in certain unacceptable ways. And I think that would be common to any of China's neighbors that you speak to. They might have a different list, a list of unacceptable behaviors of the things they want to change. I mean, our list will not be exactly the same as the US list or the Japanese list or the Russian list. But ultimately what we're trying here to do, all of us, and this is China's problem. She's in a crowded neighborhood, surrounded by other powers which are rising, and you cannot therefore run a simple containment policy like Kennan advocated, or like you would have done in a bipolar world. Today you have a situation actually when Uday speaks of multipolarity and so on, where the world economy is multipolar in practice. But the world is unipolar militarily, and it's politically thoroughly confused. So today, to speak of any single strategy, whether it's containment, whether it's engagement, whether it's whatever, I think you can't find one word for this. I think what we're doing is an ad hoc exercise with coalitions of the willing, and for me, the way forward is actually issue-based coalitions, depending on who's interested. If our concern, for instance, is freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. Now, that's a concern that several large trading states and powerful countries in the region share. Work with them and build a coalition on that. Pick the other issues which really bother you. There are some issues, your boundary with China, that's your problem. Deal with it yourself. Nobody else is going to deal. So, for me, the answer is, and I know it's an unsatisfactory answer, it's an ad hoc answer, but that's the practical way forward. Build issue-based coalitions in order to try and change people's behavior.
Can I add something, Sudha? May I also add something to what Ambassador Menon has said? You know, if I had a wish list about the telegram that you speak about, Suman, I'd frame it in the following way, that I think, first of all, in terms of viable options, the starting point is that you cannot either isolate or de-link China from the nature of the order-disorder that we have today. That's proposition number one. The second is to build on what Ambassador Menon has said, that I think the challenge conceptually is to encourage China to comply with whatever be the norms and, you know, the various guidelines that have been evolved in different domains, and signal a certain degree of compellence if it comes to that particular point. And what do I mean by that? I'll give you the illustration from the maritime domain. China has become a maritime power recently. The Hu Jintao dilemma that they talk about, the Malacca dilemma, is illustrative of that. Now, in a very limited context, China has just acquired an aircraft carrier. They're investing a lot in that particular symbolism of the carrier. They have already entered the Indian Ocean. India and the United States have some concerns about Chinese presence in the Indian Ocean. When the carrier comes, most of you in this audience are aware of what is called as MDA, Maritime Domain Awareness. When the carrier is 600 miles south of Colombo, Sri Lanka, you should be able to have 6 submarines surfacing at distances of 300-400 kilometers in a pre-designated manner with a very clear signal, along with a satellite map, which is now it's possible to map every VLCC that is carrying energy, tanker, oil, whatever, towards China. And as I said earlier, information dominance and spectrum denial, I see as technological options. And this is how I think you can come up with a menu, a matrix of seeking a certain degree of compliance through elements of compellence. And as I said, there are other things. But I think also I think the world has a choice, including India. Do you stoke China's insecurities? Or do you convey to them that there are ways of dealing with them, you know? So, I mean, I close on this as a sailor to say that you have an analogy which says, hold water on one side and row on the other if you want to turn the boat. Something along that line, you know, could be considered.
Yes, certainly. Please give the mic.
I'm sorry Deepak's not here, but I'm Mani Shankar Iyer, a failed politician. I have a problem with the terminology in which this whole argument is being worked out. We're told that on the one hand, there is a Western liberal order. Is there one? This Western liberal order had, over the period of its dominance, its hegemony, a series of pillars. These pillars included Pinochet in Chile, Stroessner in Paraguay. It involved people like Jimenez in Venezuela. It involved Batista in Cuba. It involved the Portuguese dictator. It involved Franco as one of its pillars. It involved in Africa people like Moise Tshombe. It included, again in Africa, Verwoerd. In Asia, it included, above all, and it still does, the House of Saud in Saudi Arabia. Coming nearer us, it included Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. It included certainly Ayub Khan. It also included Yahya Khan. And it went on eastwards towards Lee Kuan Yew. He was a wonderful man, but hardly a Democrat and hardly a liberal. It included Ngo Dinh Diem. It included Syngman Rhee. It included Chiang Kai-shek. The one it didn't include is the one democratic country of Asia and the post-colonial world, India, because we were non-aligned. So is the expression Western liberal order a meaningful expression, or is it an expression that is confined to ex-imperial powers who then, in the modern world, have succeeded in becoming economic hegemons because they are the richest countries in the world? So that's, I want somebody, preferably Deepak, but he's wisely decided to go away at this point, to answer the question as to what is meant by the Western liberal order.
I can't speak for Deepak. But like you, I'd put quotation marks around that. The first time the New York Times used the phrase liberal international economic order was really after the 1990s. Before that, they didn't even use the word. It's post hoc, it's a rationalization, and it's meant to convey a set of ideas and to lead you into certain forms of behavior. Did it ever exist? Was it ever liberal? Was it orderly? No. I don't think anybody, and if you're a realist, I don't think that you really take it too seriously. I mean, everything that you said is right about it being liberal or about it being very orderly. If you look at levels of violence and so on, it's just that you pushed it away from, there was no war between the great powers, and nuclear deterrence basically kept the peace between the great powers because they had nuclear weapons and didn't want to risk being destroyed. But it didn't stop other forms of violence. And we know that from our own experience with Pakistan. I mean, nuclear weapons have prevented large-scale conventional wars ever since we both embarked on nuclear programs. But you've seen the kind of violence that terrorism, other forms of violence that go on between us. So for me, yes, I mean, but I think we all know that what these words mean when we use them. I don't think anybody believes in them as somehow a great guide to action or a good predictor of what the other great powers are going to do. I think the only predictor of their actions is their definition of their own self-interest. But their definition, which is not the same as saying their real self-interest, as we might see it.
Yeah, again, I don't want to speak for Deepak, but, you know, the phrase Western liberal economic order or Western liberal order should not be looked at in isolation or in an absolute, but much more of a comparative or relative view. Now, in that, you mentioned a lot of bad leaders. In the opposite side, there was Stalin, there was Lenin, there was Mao, there was Pol Pot, and one can go on. But I think on average, and more than just on average, on a substantial degree of liberalness in the order of the Western liberals than outside. So in absolute terms, you won't find nirvana anywhere, or you won't find liberalism anywhere, even in India or in the US. At different times, you know, there are different liberality around, and I don't think we gain much by saying or alluding to an absolute concept. Now Deepak is back and he can take over.
From the Saudis to
Listed them all, Pinochet.
listed them, Pinochet to
Sorry, Mari. The question was there ever Western liberal? Well,
Phrase me.
in theory or in practice? I mean, in practice, well, no, but it's not. No, but that's now you're not talking about practice. You're not talking about practice. In theory, it's exactly what you'd expect. It's, maintaining trade, openness of trade, openness of all that, and democratic freedoms, human rights, all that. That's all part of it. But of course, that's the ideal. In practice, the examples you're giving have certain features of a liberal order, but other bits not. So it's not I mean, the trouble is, we now have started using terms. I mean, for instance, now I hear this term neoliberal. Meaningless term. What does it mean? It's a stupid term. And when I see what they're referring to, it's Adam Smith, Hume, Mill, and Hayek. What is neoliberal? These are all classical liberals. Even Keynes was a classical liberal until he did certain bits and he deviated from it. That was the ideology of economics, right until, I would say, today, classical liberals. Now, the only people who have deviated from this were first the communists, which have the other thing, and then to some extent social democracy. The American liberals are social democrats. And Schumpeter maintained it was the prestige of classical liberalism which allowed the so-called social democrats, Roosevelt onwards, to steal this word and call themselves liberals. But they're not liberals in my sense, classical liberals.
May I add a line, Sudha? Since you raised this money, sir, maybe I'll also add, he has, of course, used a certain phrase and he's written about it extensively. But I'm just thinking aloud that if you talk about India and its choices in terms of engaging with the United States, forget the liberal part. Again, I'm going back to my suggestion about path dependency, saying that if you look at the two big punctuations in recent global history, if the Axis powers had won World War II, there would have perhaps been a different kind of ecosystem, perhaps. And at the end of the Cold War, I think for India, I'm only talking about choices again, perhaps it was desirable that the Soviet Union imploded the way that it did because it represented a certain ideology. And I think for India, when we had no food to eat, PL 480 came to our rescue. I don't think at that time the choice was about liberal, illiberal. It was about, as Ambassador Menon said, our self-interest, which was very urgent and pressing at that point in time. And I think as long as the US Constitution, as also the other democratic constitutions, are there like the Holy Grail, for India, I think in like fashion to ensure that we are also compliant. There are a number of occasions when India has not been compliant. India has been illiberal at different points in time. So I think these are, in a purely, as I said, student of IR kind of situation, I would say that there is a case for Professor Lal's, shall we say, formulation as to why we should be engaging with these particular powers and not, as Surjit says, with the Stalins or the Lenins or the Maos at that point in time. If they make a change and China comes up with a constitution that is comparable and democracy flowers.
Coming back on this last point which you made, in fact, there was a time when I believed that this was a possibility. Before Tiananmen Square, I had meetings with, I forgot his name. Who was the... Chazian. And, we had private meetings and he discussed this. And he was, of course, he supported Tiananmen thing and his wife died. I hope I didn't report these talks I had with him to my students who then went off and marched on Tiananmen Square. But he was certainly in favor of something which you might call democratic rights. Manmohan would also tell you that Wen Jiabao was also very close. He also believed in these. And the thing is, China even now, I believe, is a much more diverse, in terms of thinking, much more diverse society. But where's the trend? And this is what I noticed when I was there in this conference which made me write this book. See what's happened. All these people are now in jail. He's had his purge of liberals, in my sense. He's created Xinjiang is now another gulag, and he's got a huge surveillance state. And what is more, he's downgraded Deng Xiaoping, put his father on top, and he's just creating another imperial dynasty. So, there's no hope. So whether it's liberal, illiberal, what have you like, it's a bad old Chinese polity. Middle Kingdom, emperors on top, all the other states, no equality of states, they want hook by crook, they should be vassals. And the person who explained this best was actually Lee Kuan Yew. And that's why I read his speech, he was absolutely firm. He would never let China or Singapore become a vassal of China.
Oh yes, there's one hand up there. I think that should be really the last question, unless there are more pressing ones.
Yeah.
From somebody.
My name is Deepak Dadlani. Having lived over 70 years in this country and keenly observed our institutions, our infrastructure, and various other aspects of Indian life, I haven't read the book, I must say that before I ask the question. It seems very far-fetched that India could become a superpower. I'm sure I'll be wiser after I read the book. The gap between India and USA in all aspects, maybe except culture, and India and China is so vast. And the way we are progressing, I really find it difficult to believe that this would be possible, at least for another 40, 50 years. Mine is not a cynical question, but that's the realism I see around. Thank you.
Well, I think you should read the book, because you're right. I don't believe that the gap between India and US will shrink by nuance. The US will still be the dominant power with that part. But China and India is an open question. And one of the things I spent a lot of time in the book is looking at the relative strengths, projections of future economic power, demography and all that, and they're not at all clear. I mean, India lost a lot, because firstly it didn't open up before China, and it was, I think, 11 years or something. So there's an 11-year gap. And effectively, I mean, we've shot ourselves in many ways in the foot. The latest thing with demonetization is that it could be being grown 10 to 15% for another 10, 15 years, and I think it can, if it gets the right policy. There's nothing there in our genes or anything else which says we can't. Other countries have done it, and India can do it. Now, once you look at that, and then this slowing down in China, which is already happening, and don't believe any Chinese growth rates. You read the book. Most of the growth rates you read, the published ones, just cut them by half. So China is growing at about 4 to 5% at best. And India is growing, well, I don't know, the latest say about 8. So there's that gap, and this I'm estimating in the book. It says, I think by another 10 years, it's exactly this 11-year gap. So by that time, she's following the same trajectory, but India in a shambolic way, hastening slowly, whatever you'd like to call it. So by, 27. So that's not all that far. And once that happens, then India's future prospects are much, much better than China's, because it's still got the demographic dividend, it can get all these other things together. And then there's no reason why India can't overtake China. So I'm quite optimistic in that sense.
Just very quickly, the gap between India and China in per capita incomes is 5 times or 4.5 times in dollar terms, but it is only in quotes, 2.5 times in PPP terms. There's a third year running that India's growth rate will be higher than that of China, and projecting forward, 2 to 3% excess GDP growth in India will, in 30 years' time, can be quite narrowed. And I believe the big story of the next 50 years is India's catch-up with China for the world, as well as for India. but the emphasis is there on catch up. They're absolutely the case, they're far ahead, but it is also, at least to me, quite clear that the catch up has begun, and it's a long journey.
Well, I don't think.
I think that's enough. There's one there.
I think
I think
that's
it's good,
a good
yeah.
note to end on.
Yeah.
I think we need one photograph. If you'll all please hold up the book.
Okay.
Where is the photograph? Are you there? I hope Dr. Manmohan Singh has been given a copy of the book.
Yes, I sent him one. So it's got one. Thank you, sir. Not at all.
I need to thank you all for it. Well, it remains to thank all the panelists for the extremely engaging and interesting discussion we've had this evening. I'm sure we've all learned a great deal, and we look forward to reading the book. I'd also like to thank all of you who have spent your time and been with us and made this event a success. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Very, very good. We'll have to go. We're meeting for dinner. I'm going to be annexed. Yeah. You have a bag then? I'm looking my stick to.
No, I'll take the.